In the early hours of a seemingly ordinary morning, a decision was made behind palace walls, one so quiet, so calculated, that it didn't make headlines immediately. But those closest to the monarchy felt it instantly. A man who had stood beside Camilla for 2 decades, suddenly gone. No ceremony, no explanation, just silence. And at the center of it all, Prince William. But why now? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What makes this moment so unsettling is not just the removal itself, but the weight of the man who disappeared from power. For 20 years, he wasn't merely an advisor, he was a constant, a shadow presence woven into the fabric of Camilla's influence. Someone insiders once described in hushed tones as untouchable. His voice carried weight in rooms the public would never see. His approval silently shaping decisions that would ripple far beyond palace gates. And yet, in a move that felt almost surgical in its precision, he was erased from that position without warning, without acknowledgement, without even the courtesy of a carefully worded farewell. Those within the palace were left stunned. Not because positions don't change, but because this one wasn't supposed to. This wasn't routine. This wasn't expected. It was something else entirely. Something deliberate. Something personal. As whispers began to circulate through corridors that rarely echo with uncertainty, a single name kept surfacing again and again: Prince William. Not loudly, not openly, but enough to suggest that this decision had not emerged from chaos, but from control. Over recent months, subtle shifts had already begun to signal a deeper transformation. Meetings that once followed predictable rhythms were suddenly canceled without explanation. Appearances that should have projected unity felt strained, almost rehearsed. There were glances that lingered too long, pauses that said more than words ever could. And behind it all, an unmistakable sense that power was quietly being restructured. Those closest to Camilla reportedly felt the shift most intensely, describing an atmosphere that had grown colder, more calculated, as if decisions were being made elsewhere beyond her reach. For Camilla herself, the removal struck at something deeper than politics. It wasn't just about losing an advisor. It was about losing someone who had stood beside her through years of scrutiny. Someone who had helped steady her position when it was anything but secure. And now, without warning, that foundation had been pulled away. No discussion, no negotiation, just a decision, final and unchallenged. The language being used in quiet conversations became increasingly telling. Phrases like power consolidation and internal correction began to surface, suggesting that this was not an isolated act, but part of something larger, something still unfolding. And perhaps most unsettling of all was the timing. Because nothing in the palace happens by accident. Every move carries intention. Every silence holds meaning. Which raises a question that refuses to fade: why now? Why him? And more importantly, what changed? Because this wasn't just about one man losing a position, it was the unraveling of a relationship that had quietly shaped the monarchy for years. For 20 years, he was never the headline, but always the architect behind them. The advisor who knew everything, and everyone. Trusted by Camilla, feared by some, respected by most. Yet the deeper you look, the more unsettling the picture becomes. Because this wasn't just a loyal aide, this was a gatekeeper of secrets. And perhaps, someone who knew too much. Long before his sudden removal sent shockwaves through the palace, his presence had already become something far more complex than a simple advisory role. He wasn't just offering guidance, he was shaping reality. Access to Camilla often flowed through him, conversations filtered, narratives refined before they ever reached the public. Those who worked within the palace understood an unspoken truth: if you wanted to reach her, you had to go through him. And that kind of influence doesn't just happen, it's built, carefully, over years of loyalty, strategy, and silence. During the most turbulent chapters of Camilla's public life, when scrutiny threatened to overwhelm her position, he stood firm as her shield. Not in the spotlight, never openly, but always there, managing crises, redirecting narratives, ensuring that what the public saw was never the full story. It was a role that demanded absolute trust, and for a long time, he had it. But trust, especially in a place like the palace, is never permanent. It shifts, it erodes, and sometimes it turns into something else entirely. Behind closed doors, his influence reportedly extended into decisions that shaped how the monarchy itself was perceived. Subtle adjustments in messaging, strategic silences, carefully timed responses, these were not accidents. They were calculated moves, part of a larger effort to maintain control over an institution that survives on perception as much as power. Yet for all his discretion, there were whispers. Quiet at first, almost dismissible. That he controlled too much. That information didn't always flow freely. That decisions were being influenced in ways not everyone agreed with. And those whispers didn't stay quiet for long. Among the younger generation of royals, particularly Prince William, there was a growing sense of unease. It wasn't open conflict, not yet, but something more subtle. A tension that lingered in conversations, in meetings, in the way certain decisions were questioned rather than accepted. William, increasingly focused on reshaping the monarchy into something leaner, more transparent, began to see figures like this advisor not as assets but as obstacles. The contrast was impossible to ignore. On one side, a man who had built his power through control, through managing narratives and guarding access. On the other, a future king determined to redefine how that power should function. And somewhere in the middle stood Camilla, bound by years of loyalty yet surrounded by a system that was beginning to shift beneath her feet. What made the situation even more volatile was the emotional complexity behind it. This wasn't just politics, it was personal. The advisor's loyalty to Camilla had never been questioned. But loyalty in one direction often creates suspicion in another. To some, he wasn't just protecting her, he was protecting a way of operating that no longer aligned with where the monarchy was heading. And as William's vision grew stronger, so too did the quiet resistance against anything that stood in its way. There were moments small, almost insignificant on the surface, that hinted at deeper fractures. Decisions delayed, proposals quietly rejected, conversations that ended without resolution, each one adding to a growing sense that something was building, something inevitable. And perhaps the most telling sign of all was this. Despite his decades of service, despite his influence, there was no defense when the final decision came. No public support. No internal pushback strong enough to stop it. Almost as if the resistance had already done its work long before the removal itself. Because in the palace, power rarely disappears overnight, it's weakened first, quietly, until the moment comes when it can be removed without resistance. And as his influence grew, so did the quiet resistance against him, resistance that would eventually find its most powerful voice in Prince William. Prince William has always been seen as the future of the monarchy, but what if the future was already here? Behind his calm public image lies a leader reshaping the institution in ways few can see. And when it came to Camilla's most trusted advisor, William didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. He simply acted. Because sometimes, power isn't announced, it's executed. For years, his transformation had been unfolding quietly, almost invisibly, hidden behind carefully measured appearances and composed public statements. But beneath that controlled exterior, something far more decisive was taking shape. The transitions within the royal family had not just altered titles, they had shifted gravity itself. And William, whether by necessity or design, had begun stepping into a role that demanded more than symbolism. It demanded control. Not loud, not reckless, but precise. Calculated. Unquestionable. Those closest to the inner workings of the palace had begun to notice it long before the public ever could. A change in tone. A sharper edge in discussions. A refusal to accept the slow-moving traditions that once defined royal decision-making. William was no longer observing the system, he was reshaping it. And with that came a vision that was both ambitious and disruptive. A monarchy that was leaner, faster, more transparent, but also more tightly controlled. The challenge, however, was not in defining that vision, it was in confronting what stood in its way. Figures like Camilla's advisor represented something more than just experience. They represented a system built on influence, on carefully managed narratives, on an understanding that power could exist without ever being visible. And to William, that kind of power was not just outdated, it was dangerous. Because it operated beyond accountability. Reports of private disagreements between the two had circulated quietly for years, never confirmed, but never denied. Conversations that began as professional quickly turned tense. Proposals met with resistance. Ideas challenged. Not dismissed, but delayed subtly, strategically. It was a clash not of personalities, but of philosophies. One rooted in preservation, the other in transformation. And at the center of it all was a question William could no longer ignore: how do you move forward when the past refuses to step aside? Emotionally, the weight of that question ran deeper than it appeared. This was not just about control, it was about legacy, about protecting an institution that had defined generations, while ensuring it didn't collapse under its own history. William wasn't just fighting resistance, he was confronting a system that had, in many ways, shaped the very structure he now sought to change. And that conflict, quiet as it was, carried a tension that could not last forever. The removal of the advisor was not sudden. It only appeared that way from the outside. In reality, it had all the markings of something carefully planned. A decision built over time, reinforced through moments of frustration, solidified through strategy. The timing itself spoke volumes. Not too early, not too late, but at a moment when resistance could no longer hold. And perhaps most telling of all was how it was executed. No confrontation. No drawn-out battle, just a decision final, irreversible. The kind of move that doesn't just remove a person, but sends a message. And that message was clear to those willing to see it. This was not an isolated act. It was a signal, a warning, that the era of quiet influence operating beyond oversight was coming to an end, that the balance of power within the palace was shifting, not gradually, but decisively, and that William was no longer preparing for the future, he was already shaping it. But while William's intentions may have been clear to him, the emotional fallout, especially for Camilla, was only just beginning. For years, she relied on him not just as an advisor, but as a constant in a world that rarely offered stability. And then, in a moment she didn't control, he was gone. No discussion, no defense, just a decision made without her. For Camilla, this wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. And it may have marked the first real fracture in her influence. What made the moment even more striking was the depth of that reliance. A bond forged not in convenience but in survival. Through years when public perception wavered and scrutiny intensified, he had remained by her side, steady, unwavering, a presence she could depend on when everything else felt uncertain. He wasn't just advising her, he was protecting her, insulating her from pressures that could have easily overwhelmed her position. That kind of trust isn't built quickly, and it certainly isn't broken without consequence. So when he was removed without her input, it wasn't simply a decision, it was a disruption, a sudden rupture in a system she believed she still had control over. And that realization, quiet as it may have been, carried a weight far heavier than any public statement ever could. Those within her inner circle began to feel it almost immediately. The shift wasn't loud, but it was undeniable. Conversations became more cautious. Familiar faces carried uncertainty where confidence once existed. Loyalists who had long operated under the assumption that their positions were secure through their connection to her began to question everything. If someone so central could be removed so abruptly, what did that mean for the rest of them? The stability they had relied on suddenly felt fragile, conditional, subject to forces they could neither see nor influence. And in that growing unease, a new dynamic began to take shape, one defined not by loyalty, but by survival. Camilla, however, remained composed in public, as she always had. Her appearances revealed nothing, her expressions carefully measured, her presence as steady as ever. But behind that controlled exterior, the emotional reality was far more complex. Reports began to surface of tension during private gatherings, moments where conversations faltered, where an unspoken awareness lingered just beneath the surface. It wasn't confrontation, not directly, but something more restrained, more subtle. A recognition that something had shifted, and that it could not be undone. The removal of her advisor had done more than take away a trusted figure, it had redefined the boundaries of her influence. It raised a question that had never needed to be asked before. How much control did she truly have? And perhaps more importantly, how much had already slipped beyond her reach without her realizing it? The symbolism of the moment was impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about one man leaving a position. It was about the quiet transfer of power, the subtle rebalancing of authority within the monarchy. A signal that decisions could now be made without her, around her, even against her. And while nothing had been said openly, the message was clear enough for those paying attention. The structure she had come to rely on was no longer guaranteed. The influence she had built was no longer untouchable. And beneath all of it lay a deeper, more unsettling possibility that this wasn't an isolated incident, but the beginning of something larger. Something that extended beyond one advisor, beyond one decision, beyond even her own position. Because when control begins to shift, it rarely stops at a single point. It moves, quietly, steadily, until everything has been redefined. And as the palace struggled to maintain its polished image, whispers began to spread, whispers that hinted at something far deeper beneath the surface. What if this wasn't about loyalty or power, but about secrets? Because those closest to the situation suggest that the advisor's removal wasn't just strategic, it was necessary. Necessary to prevent something from coming to light. Something that could have shaken the monarchy far more than a quiet dismissal ever could. And suddenly, the question isn't why he was removed, but what he knew. The deeper this story unfolds, the more unsettling its edges become. Because power struggles can be explained, disagreements can be managed, but secrets change everything. For 2 decades, this advisor had been positioned at the intersection of decisions that were never meant to be fully understood by the public. He wasn't just present, he was involved, embedded in moments where narratives were crafted, where delicate situations were reshaped before they could spiral beyond control. And with that level of proximity comes knowledge. Not fragments, not rumors, but a complete, unfiltered understanding of how the monarchy protected itself when the stakes were highest. Whispers now suggest that his removal may not have been about what he was doing, but about what he knew. Sensitive information tied to past decisions. Moments where the line between truth and preservation blurred. Strategies that ensured stability but came at a cost. These weren't just professional disagreements. They were fractures over how far the monarchy should go to protect its image. Allegations began to surface quietly, hinting at internal conflicts over narratives that had been carefully constructed and maintained for years. Not everyone agreed on how those narratives should evolve. Some believed in continued control, in managing perception at all costs. Others, William among them, appeared to lean toward a different approach, one that risked exposure in exchange for credibility. And in that clash, the advisor stood as a symbol of the old system. A system built on silence, on strategic omissions, on the belief that stability required secrecy. But secrecy, when held too tightly, becomes a liability. And those who carry it become something even more dangerous. Because knowledge, in the wrong moment, can shift power entirely. There are suggestions, subtle but persistent, that he may have been involved in decisions that, if revisited, could raise uncomfortable questions. Decisions made during moments of crisis, when the monarchy had to choose between transparency and survival. And while those choices may have been justified at the time, their legacy doesn't disappear. It lingers, quietly, waiting. The tension between transparency and secrecy had been building for years. But now it was reaching a breaking point. William's vision for the future didn't just challenge tradition, it threatened to expose the mechanisms that tradition relied on. And for someone like the advisor, whose entire influence was built on managing those mechanisms, that shift was more than ideological, it was existential. The emotional weight of this possibility cannot be ignored. Fear doesn't always reveal itself openly, especially within institutions designed to project control. But it exists in decisions made quickly, in actions taken without explanation, in removals that feel less like change and more like containment. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing isn't what someone is doing, it's what they could reveal if they were pushed too far. And that raises a question that cuts deeper than any official narrative ever could. Was this removal truly about reform? Or was it about prevention? A move made not to reshape the future, but to protect the past from resurfacing. Because if the advisor represented a risk, then removing him wasn't just strategic, it was necessary. Not as an act of power, but as an act of control. Control over information. Control over perception. Control over what remains hidden. And if that's the case, then this decision carries consequences far beyond a single position. It suggests a monarchy that is not just evolving but defending itself in ways that may never be fully understood. But if secrets were the catalyst, then the consequences of this decision were far from over. Inside the palace, unity is everything, or at least, that's what the world is meant to see. But behind closed doors, this decision has created lines that can't be easily erased. Loyalty is being tested. Alliances are shifting. And for the first time in years, the monarchy isn't just navigating public pressure, it's facing internal division. What once appeared seamless, almost immovable, has begun to fracture in ways that cannot be easily concealed from those living within it. The removal of a single advisor has done something far more dangerous than disrupt routine. It has exposed fault lines that were always there, quietly buried beneath tradition and protocol. Now, those lines are widening. Within the palace, factions have begun to take shape. Not openly, not in ways that could be publicly acknowledged, but in subtle alignments and quiet decisions that reveal where loyalties truly lie. Some have gravitated toward William's vision, seeing in it a necessary evolution, a chance to secure the monarchy's future before it becomes trapped by its own history. Others remain rooted in the past, not out of resistance alone, but out of belief that the system as it stood had survived for a reason, and that dismantling it too quickly could create instability far greater than any perceived reform. And in the space between those two perspectives, tension has taken hold. Conversations that once flowed with ease now carry hesitation. Words are chosen more carefully. Silences last longer. The emotional strain is no longer hidden beneath polite exchanges, it lingers, unspoken but deeply felt. Relationships that were once defined by mutual understanding are now strained by uncertainty, each interaction shaped by the knowledge that something fundamental has changed. And perhaps most unsettling of all is that no one is entirely sure where this leads. The removal of the advisor was not just an isolated act, it was a catalyst. A signal that change is not only possible, but already underway. And with that realization comes a question that no one can comfortably answer. If this could happen to someone so established, so deeply embedded, then what comes next? Beneath the surface, power struggles are beginning to emerge. Not in dramatic confrontations, but in small, calculated moments. Decisions subtly challenged. Authority quietly tested. Influence measured not by titles, but by outcomes. It is a quieter form of conflict, but no less significant. Because in a place where appearances must remain controlled, the real battles are never fought openly, they are fought through positioning, through timing, through the ability to shape outcomes without ever appearing to do so. And as these dynamics continue to shift, concerns about long-term stability are beginning to grow. Not publicly, not in any official sense, but within the minds of those who understand how fragile balance can be when it is disrupted. The monarchy has always relied on continuity, on the illusion of steady progression. But now, that illusion is being tested. The tension between tradition and evolution is no longer theoretical, it is active, unfolding, impossible to ignore. And at the center of it all is a single undeniable truth: this moment has changed something. Not just structurally, but emotionally, psychologically. The sense of certainty that once defined the palace has been replaced with something else, something less predictable, something far more volatile. Because when unity begins to fracture, even slightly, it doesn't just affect the present, it reshapes the future. And while the palace wrestled with its internal fractures, the outside world was beginning to notice something wasn't quite right. To the public, nothing seemed out of place. Appearances continued. Smiles remained. But beneath the carefully crafted image, a very different story was unfolding. Because what the world saw wasn't what was happening. And the deeper you look, the clearer it becomes this wasn't just a quiet change. It was a turning point. The silence from the palace was not unusual in itself, after all. Silence has always been one of its most powerful tools. But this time, it felt different. Heavier. More deliberate. There was no statement, no acknowledgement, no attempt to frame the narrative in a way that would reassure or redirect attention. Instead, there was nothing. And in that absence, speculation began to grow, filling the gaps left behind with questions that refused to settle. The media, as expected, began circling the story, offering fragments, interpretations, theories, but without confirmation. Everything remained just out of reach. And perhaps that was the point, because in a system built on perception, what is not said often carries more weight than what is. The contrast between public composure and private tension became increasingly difficult to ignore. Outwardly, the monarchy continued as it always had: measured appearances, controlled messaging, an image of unity carefully maintained. But beneath that surface, something far more complex was unfolding. The emotional disconnect was subtle, almost invisible to those not looking for it, but unmistakable once seen. A pause that lingered too long, a response that felt just slightly restrained. The kind of details that don't make headlines, but slowly reshape how a story is understood. For those who followed closely, the shift was undeniable. This was not just a personnel change, it was a recalibration of power, one that the palace was choosing not to explain, perhaps because explaining it would reveal more than intended. Silence, in this context, was not avoidance. It was strategy. A way to maintain control without inviting scrutiny. Because once questions are officially acknowledged, they must be answered. And some answers are far more dangerous than the questions themselves. As curiosity grew, so did the sense that this moment was part of something larger. Royal watchers, analysts, those who had spent years observing the smallest shifts within the institution, began to notice patterns. Not just in what had happened, but in what might follow. Because decisions like this rarely exist in isolation. They are signals, indicators of direction, of intent, of change that has not yet fully revealed itself. And if one figure, so deeply embedded, could be removed without explanation, then what did that suggest about what comes next? The possibility lingered, unspoken but persistent, that this was only the beginning. That other changes, equally quiet but equally significant, might already be in motion. The idea was unsettling, not because change itself is unusual, but because of how it was happening without transparency, without acknowledgement, without the usual markers that allow the public to understand what is unfolding. It created a sense of distance, a growing gap between perception and reality that could not be easily reconciled. And in that gap, uncertainty began to take hold, because when control is maintained through silence, it also creates a vacuum, one that invites speculation, doubt, and the possibility that the truth is far more complicated than anyone is willing to admit. And as the dust began to settle, one question remained: was this the end of the story, or just the beginning? Every decision comes with a cost, and for Prince William, this may have been one of the most defining moves of his future reign. Because removing a man isn't just about the present, it's about shaping what comes next. The question is, at what price? Because in reshaping the monarchy, something may have been lost along the way. What now begins to emerge is not just a moment, but a pattern, a direction that is becoming harder to ignore. William's vision, once subtle and quietly forming, is now taking clearer shape, no longer hidden behind gradual shifts, but revealed through decisive action. This was never just about one advisor. It was about drawing a line between what the monarchy was and what it must become. And in doing so, William has stepped into a role that demands not just leadership, but authority strong enough to override history itself. Yet authority comes with its own burden. Because every act of control raises an equally powerful question: how much trust is being sacrificed to maintain it? Within the royal family, the emotional consequences of this decision are still unfolding, lingering beneath formal appearances and carefully measured interactions. Relationships that once relied on quiet understanding are now shadowed by something else: uncertainty. A sense that decisions are no longer shared, but imposed. And while this may strengthen structure, it also creates distance. Because control, when exercised too firmly, can isolate even those who wield it. The removal of the advisor has come to represent more than a strategic shift. It marks the symbolic end of an era. An era where influence operated behind closed doors, where loyalty ensured protection, where power was often invisible but deeply rooted. That system, for better or worse, has now been disrupted. And with its removal comes an unavoidable truth: what replaces it is still uncertain. William's approach suggests a monarchy that is sharper, more defined, less tolerant of ambiguity. But it also raises a question that no one within the palace can fully answer yet. How far is he willing to go to enforce that vision? Because change, once initiated, rarely stops where it begins. It continues, pushing boundaries, testing limits, forcing decisions that become increasingly difficult to reverse. The monarchy now stands at a crossroads, caught between the weight of its past and the pressure of its future. One path offers continuity, familiarity, the comfort of a system that has endured. The other demands transformation, risk, and the willingness to let go of structures that once defined its strength. And at the center of that choice is William. No longer just the future of the institution, but its present force of direction. What makes this moment so powerful is not just the decision itself, but what it represents: a shift in how power is understood, how it is used, and how it is justified. Because power is never just about action. It is about consequence. It is about the unseen sacrifices that accompany every choice, the relationships strained, the trust tested, the balance that must constantly be recalibrated. And perhaps the most difficult realization of all is this: in securing the future, something from the past is always left behind. Something that cannot be restored, cannot be undone. Because in the end, this wasn't just about one removal, it was about who truly holds power, and what they're willing to do to keep it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.